Futures in Fundraising is presented by Alexander Haas. Alexander Haas, transforming institutions that transform lives.
Welcome to Futures in Fundraising. I'm David King, president of Alexander Haas, and your host for Futures in Fundraising. We have two guests with us today. We have with us Jenny Jones, assistant professor of nonprofit leadership, easy for me to say, and management at the University of Florida, and David Daniel, who is director of field operations for the Nature Conservancy. Jenny and David have been working on some very interesting research into working with and communicating with donors. And we're thrilled to have you guys with us today to talk about that.
Thanks, David. Glad to be here.
Welcome. So, David, let me start with you. Let me ask you on the practitioner side, what was it that you were seeing happening in the field that led you to connect with Jenny on this research piece?
Yeah, David, thanks. So I was the director of development for the Nature Conservancy in Maine, as you know, moved to Maine about 10 years ago. And pretty soon after taking that job, our work at the Nature Conservancy really started to shift. Maine has always been a state chapter that's on the leading edge of what we're doing at the Nature Conservancy. And we were starting to experiment with some new types of projects. As maybe some of the people on the call will know, the Nature Conservancy has traditionally been a land conservation organization. We've conserved a lot of land in our history. We've looked for threatened pieces of land and then gone and bought it. And it's been pretty simple to explain that to donors. Right. And in Maine, which is a heavily land state, we've done a lot of that kind of work. But soon after I took over, the work started to change. We were starting to work in helping fisheries rebound in the Gulf of Maine. We were looking at trying to balance hydropower needs with ecological needs on the Penobscot River. So these projects were bigger, they were longer in time scale, and they were harder for me to get my arms around. And so as I started to struggle with it myself, I started to see our donors struggle with it as well. They were having a hard time understanding the return on philanthropic investment that they've become so used to. You know, we had the message at TNC, if you give us money, we're going to go buy that piece of land. It was pretty simple, right?
A to B is really easy to connect on that, right?
Right. And now it was more like, if you give us money, then we're going to try and we're going to learn and we're going to try and we're going to learn. And maybe 30 years from now, some big outcome is going to happen. So really, really exciting to think about that we're trying to tackle bigger problems, but harder for donors to understand the impact. And so as we started to understand and struggle with this, I said, I got to get some help. I got to find out who's doing interesting research in this field that's going to help us communicate with donors. And so through some mutual friends that Dr. Jones and I had, I was able to meet her over the phone, and we started talking about this research, and that's really how we got started.
So Jenny, tell us a little bit about those initial conversations and about the research that you guys came up with.
Sure. So I'll tell you first, my background is practice. I come from practice, and I, like David, was in practice in a fundraising and communications role and struggling with how do we share this message. And I went back and got my PhD to help answer some of these questions. And David called me right when I was just working on my dissertation, 2014. And we began a conversation that has lasted now for 4 years, and we've done several research projects together. But what I look at is how we change over the course of our lifetime. Developmental theorists like Robert Keegan and William Torbert have found that over the course of a lifetime, adults develop an increasingly complex way of making meaning. How we think when we're in our early 20s is fundamentally different from later stages of our life. And that change is progressive, and it's also predictable. So we can plot those changes into some stages that aren't necessarily connected to age norms, but we can think about how a donor's thinking is going to evolve over the course of time, and then begin to understand where they are today and how to interact with them.
Okay, and how, let me ask you a methodology question here. How do you study that?
So there are a couple of different ways to do it. The way that I approach this is through the subject-object interview. So this is coming off of the theoretical line of Robert Keegan, who's out of Harvard. And it is a way of interviewing that usually takes about 60 to 90 minutes, where you're asking a series of prompting questions and probing questions to understand how somebody thinks. If you want to do a formal assessment, again, it takes 60 to 90 minutes. But what David and I are teaching fundraisers how to do is how to just insert a couple of subtle probing and prompting questions in a routine conversation to begin to get a sense of how donors make meaning.
Okay. Can you give us an example of a couple of those maybe?
Sure. So one of the questions that we have found to be really useful is very simple. Tell me about an initiative or project that you have funded that's particularly meaningful to you. Okay. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a really simple question. But when you ask it and really listen and you probe for why, and you ask why about 6 or 7 times, not why, but you ask different ways of asking why.
But why?
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to sound like a 2-year-old. But if you ask why 6 or 7 times in different ways, you really get a sense of how that donor is thinking about their work.
So, David, tell us a little bit about how you have deployed this.
Yeah, so we've deployed it in a couple of different ways. We started with me being a practitioner myself. I wanted to understand it. And so once I met Jenny and we started talking about this, we basically designed David a feasibility study interview. We did our own feasibility study in Maine, where we took our evolving conservation case and put it in front of, it was 40 donors, trustees and donors. And Jenny and I designed a feasibility study interview where we not only asked them what they think about the work. So we sent them the case ahead of time and said, what do you think? We also were trying to get at how did they think about it? And so we set up the interviews in a different way. We told the donors that it was going to feel different because it was going to be a little slower paced. We were going to be asking them a little bit more about who they were and how they think about their philanthropy. So we kind of set it up in the beginning, and many of those interviews we actually recorded as part of a research project, and the donors consented to that. And so we were able through this process to be practitioners, to go in and be really present in these conversations and ask these questions and then ask the probing follow-up questions. And we were hearing things from these donors like, I've never thought about this stuff before. We had couples saying to each other, we've never talked with each other about these things before. Because what we were getting them to do is take what was in their subconscious mind, the beliefs that were operating that were causing them to make decisions about their philanthropy. We were bringing those to the surface for them to see them. And so it was in many ways the first time they'd been able to do that. And so it was first through a practitioner lens. And then second was, can we actually train fundraisers to go out and do this? Is it possible that we can teach people to be really present, to set up the conversations, to ask the questions, to ask the probing questions, and to listen for not only the content of what the donor is saying, but the structure of their thinking. And we found it to be, we're in our early stages of trying to get fundraisers to do this, but I can speak from personal experience that it opened up relationships that had been fairly closed off to me as a fundraiser previously, because it was helping them see things about themselves and self-reflect in ways they hadn't before.
So I would imagine one of the challenges to doing this is you have to have fundraisers who have a real commitment to doing donor cultivation and not just solicitation all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would argue that this is a fabulous technique for fundraisers who are seasoned, who've been in the field for a number of years, who are comfortable in themselves and their approaches and talking to donors. This is something that would be useful for them. I wouldn't propose it for somebody who's brand new to fundraising.
So Jenny, let me ask you this: as you guys did this research, were there any suppositions or theories that you guys had when you started that you were surprised by the actual outcomes at the end?
That's a really great question. So we were doing mostly what would be called grounded theory research, where we were not going in with hypotheses that we were testing, but trying to figure out, how does this work? What does this look like? And drawing conclusions from the data rather than going in a priori. That said, there were a lot of surprises when we began training fundraisers. And one of the things that was really very cool, where we had been working recently with a state chapter at the Nature Conservancy, training both fundraisers and program staff to do this work, and to be able to see the relationships between the program staff and the fundraisers and how they each approach fundraising differently, but how they could think about it together was really very exciting to see.
Yeah, I think we with our client work, we often see a real disconnect between the program staff, whether it's faculty at a college or social workers in a human service organization, or teachers in a school, and the development office. We will often hear the other staff say, "I don't know what those guys do. They seem to go to lunch a lot." Those kinds of things. Yeah. All right, we're going to take a really quick break, and we'll be right back with more with Jenny and David.
I first became familiar with Alexander Haas roughly 10 years ago when I was living in the Atlanta area and I was running a consulting firm called Advancement Solutions, focusing primarily on the advancement services and operations arena. But it was at the same time that there were many changes going on in the area of tax law and reform, and so I became familiar with Alexander Haas and they became familiar with me, and over time we developed a relationship where if they, Alexander Haas, found that they had a client needing my kind of assistance, that they would contact me and I would be added to their program for a particular client. 5 years later or so, I went to work at NC State and was the campaign manager for a $1.6 billion campaign. And when I left and returned to full-time consulting, David King and Alexander Haas and I developed a stronger relationship. And roughly 2 years ago, I was asked if I would become a partner of the firm, and the rest is history.
All right, we are back. Today we're joined by Jenny Jones from the University of Florida and David Daniel from the Nature Conservancy. Jenny, I want to circle back with you to where we started this conversation, which was talking about the stages of life and how the stages of life impact, I guess it's not just donative behavior, but human behavior and human thought processes. And maybe ask you if you can take us through that a little bit. And my guess is that it's not ages 1 to 12, but ranges that are a little fuzzier than that because people develop at different paces. But I wonder if you could talk us through those stages and what you found to be the difference in how donors react when they're in those stages.
Sure. Well, I have found actually that how donors think maps pretty closely to what developmental theorists have found, that we change over the course of our lifetime in predictable ways. And there's really three big ways of thinking, three big changes that we go through. Lots of sub-changes, lots of sub-stages in there, but three big ways. And the first way, I'll begin by talking about a teenager. And if you imagine a teenager that goes out...
I don't have to imagine it. I have two of them at home.
Well, okay, so imagine your teenager. They've gone out to a party. They want to stay a little bit later. They're having a great time. What are they worried about?
Calling me and getting permission to do that.
Yep, they're worried about getting in trouble. What's dad going to think, right? So they are able to mediate their behavior in order to get what they want. In this case, they want to stay out and have a little bit more fun. When we leave adolescence and enter into our early 20s, we begin to learn how to actually think about not just how do I not get punished from dad, but what's dad thinking or feeling? He must be really worried about me. We can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and imagine what their experience is like. Okay. It's a huge developmental milestone, and we begin to spontaneously and regularly do it in our early 20s after adolescence. Now, that stage for most adults lasts most of their life. Eventually, some adults will realize that if I'm always thinking about what I do using somebody else as my measuring stick, it can get really confusing, because what my parents are telling me versus what I've learned in school versus what my boss wants, those all conflict. And if those all conflict, I don't know how to make my own decisions. And so eventually we learn how to go, okay, I kind of like this from my parents. I kind of like that from school. My boss is making a little bit of sense here, but I really experience it differently. And we create our own self-authored way of thinking. Dr. Robert Keegan calls this the self-authoring stage. Adults are usually between that first stage and that second stage, moving towards the second stage. Fewer adults get to that full-on self-second stage. The third stage is when we begin to realize that, yes, I can have my own ideas and thoughts, but all of those ideas and thoughts are colored by my culture, by my beliefs. There's always assumptions that I'm making behind those ideas. And so I'm no longer interested in finding the best idea. I'm interested in deconstructing the ideas. I'm interested in questioning the assumptions and living in the inquiry rather than in the answer, if that makes sense.
Does anybody without a PhD ever get there?
Pardon?
Does anybody who doesn't have a PhD ever get there?
Actually, I would kind of argue PhD makes it harder to get there. But yeah, so very few people actually get to that fully self-transforming stage. That's what Robert Keegan calls it, self-transforming. Most of us are between the first stage, socialized mind, and self-authoring. And from a donor's perspective, what that means is how I make decisions about giving is embedded in these relationships. It's embedded at the first stage in the relationships I have with the organization. It's embedded in the political ideology that I'm affiliated with, for example. And I can't really separate myself from those kinds of ideas to make my own self-authored idea. At the self-authored stage, of course, that is what they can do. That's the hallmark of that stage. And so that's where you hear the donor saying, this is what you got to do. Here's how you got to do it. And I'm not giving you money unless you do it that way.
Okay. All right, great. Well, that's interesting. And I'm trying to put myself in what stage where I think I am.
There you go. There's one of you were asking earlier, kind of what are the suppositions that we had going in. And one of the surprises, I think, for both of us was this becomes a intensely personal journey as you do this, because you do start to think about, well, how do I make meaning? How do I think about this stuff? And I think I don't know if it's equally important to what we're trying to do with donors, but it's becoming a really important part of our work, is helping fundraisers and staff within these organizations understand how are they relating to the work as the work becomes more complex, and how does that land with the way that they show up with the donor? And that's a really, that feels a little bit better to be able to work on yourself rather than only focusing on what the donor is doing. So it's two sides to a coin.
So I want to direct our audience. There's a summary of this research in the spring 2018 edition of Advancing Philanthropy. If you're interested, you can go to AFP's website, and it's on there, and you can get the overview of it. But David, I wanted to ask you if you would, for our audience for this, to give us some thoughts about what people can do when they're finished watching this podcast to begin to implement this and get the kind of results that you've had using it at the Nature Conservancy. So
I've learned from Jenny over the years that we've been working together, this requires rigorous learning, kind of learning about yourself and understanding yourself. So I think neither one of us would encourage people to go out and try to use this methodology without some really heavy training. That being said, I think what's important is that as the work that we're trying to do in nonprofits grows in complexity, we're all trying to tackle bigger and bigger issues, and that's great. I think it's important for us to understand that our donors are going on that journey with us. And we hope. That's a great point, right? So there's been research, and I'm sure you know this research, David, from Penelope Burke over the last few years, that's looking at why are people not giving as much as they could give? And the number one reason that donors give is the inability of the nonprofit to articulate impact. Yep. So what I would think about, one of the things that I think people can immediately do in nonprofits is look at how you're messaging your work and think about, am I articulating impact in a short-term, medium-term, and long-term way? Am I showing donors how I'm going to solve an immediate problem now, how we're looking to create kind of ROI in the midterm so we can really achieve some results, and also speaking about the big impact that we're trying to have on a longer time scale. So the more we can communicate in ways that these three donor groups can each find themselves in, I think that's a really important step. So one thing is audit your communications and think about, am I communicating about this with donors that's going to connect with them where they are? So that's number one. Second is when you're spending time with donors, really kind of explore your own relationship with, what is it that I believe about money? What is it that I believe about philanthropy? What is it that I believe about this donor? Our beliefs, I think the core of Jenny and my research is that beliefs drive our actions. And then our actions provide the results, and then they go back and reinforce the beliefs. So unless we explore our own beliefs, then we show up in a subconscious way with donors. So explore your relationship with, do you think the donor has power over you? Do you think that because they have wealth, they somehow mean more than you? Do you think that is asking for money scary? Do you believe that it is? If you do, then you show up in a certain way to the relationship. So there's a great opportunity here for us as fundraisers to say, who are we as this kind of instrument of enacting our donors' values, and how am I going to show up to the relationship here to make that happen, to be the facilitator of their values, versus, kind of this enactor of transactions. So there's also deeply personal work that can happen. So those are a couple things that come to mind.
So one of the things you mentioned was communicating, and I'm thinking that communicating with people in these three stages face to face, for someone who's intuitive and properly trained, either trained in your technique or just, there are other sort of trainings. A lot of people do this with sales training and in how to sort of figure out the personality type of the person you're talking with and mirror their type.
Right.
So doing it face to face is one thing. Communicating with people in this early stage where their decision making is really heavily shaped by what others think, and in this latter stage where they're going to deconstruct ideas and Jenny, I may misquote you here, but sort of deconstruct the idea and then pull the pieces that resonate for them back together. To communicate to them in one case statement would seem to be an incredible challenge.
Yeah, it is something that David and I are trying to figure out how to do well. And one of the things that we talk about with fundraisers is creating these little buoys in between where you are and where it is that you want to go, and mapping out the buoys. And the buoys are the short, the medium, and the longer term pieces. My experience, having interviewed many donors in these different stages, is that the shorter term ones are going to be the ones that are really appealing to earlier stage donors, and that the later stage donors want to see the integration. In fact, when I talk to them, you can hear in their language that they're integrating inputs, outputs, outcomes, impacts. These aren't separate things to them. They're all deeply related. In the same way a tapestry, the threads are all deeply related.
So, David, let me ask this sort of to get to a sort of practical piece of this. So I'm going to use the Nature Conservancy as an example, but I'm going to make some stuff up here. So bear with me. So you're doing a project in Maine about restoring fisheries, and this is a big project and it's long term, and you're probably trying some techniques that have never been tried before, maybe anywhere in the world, to do this, and you won't really know whether it worked for 15 years, maybe longer.
Right.
But do you since you don't necessarily know the stage your donor is in, do you present the big picture, but also present milestones in between that donors could react to and contribute to if they're in this early stage and they really sort of need this A to B and it's done, versus if they're in the broader stage and they're going to sort of pull all the elements together? Is that a way that you try to approach it?
I think that's a great way to put it. And if you were making that up, it was really impressive, which I know you have that ability. So I love that. But I think that is what we do. So when we describe our fisheries work in Maine, what we describe is what is the long-term vision that we're trying to achieve? Because I think you and Jenny and I would all agree, and hopefully everyone on this call would agree, donors all in a way want to transform something, right? They're what they think about in terms of transformation is different. The time scale that they're able to think about, but they do all want to know that, for instance, the Nature Conservancy is trying to solve climate change, or the Nature Conservancy is trying to restore the Gulf of Maine. But then we do have to describe at what those buoys are. So for that first donor, we need to say, we need to buy 2 fishing permits and lease them back to fishermen and have them test more sustainable fishing gear. That's what we're going to do in the next 12 months. Yeah. For that ROI person, what we need to say is we need to get cameras on all the boats, because the way we count fish stocks is woefully underrepresented. Yeah. So we got to buy 50 cameras, put them on the boats, and as a result, we're going to achieve these results. And then for that third stage of donor, we need to talk about what we're trying to do is we're really trying to bring the socio-ecological system together. We're trying to get the fishermen to stay on the water. We're trying to get the stocks back. We're thinking about the impact of climate change on the Gulf, and they're able to think at that. So we want to describe all 3 of those so that each of them has a toehold and says, I'm good with this. I feel comfortable with this. I think the danger we run into is we get fascinated with the long-term impact. Mm-hmm. We get fascinated with that third level of donor, and we communicate in that way, and it loses the others. And what we end up with is people that say, I trust you, but I'm taking a 0 off my gift. Yeah. I'll give you a gift, but I don't understand.
I can't get my head around this. I don't know how I don't know how my gift can matter. Yeah.
What are you going to do with my money? And that's, so we need to be able to communicate in each of those ways.
That's great. Well, Jenny, if people want to get in touch with you about this research or other research or with questions, how can they do that?
Yes, please. My email is jenniferajones@ufl.edu. You can also reach me from the University of Florida's website. David and I have been piloting some trainings for the Nature Conservancy, and now we're trying to figure out how can we share this more broadly. So I'm very interested in talking to anybody who'd like to know more. And then also, I would like to encourage any fundraiser out there that is interested in working more closely with somebody in a faculty role and an academic role, just to reach out. We love hearing from practitioners and figuring out how can we create projects that are win-win.
Great. Well, I would like to thank you, Jenny and David, for joining us today. This is really fascinating research. I read the summary, and then I also read the full research report, although I'm not sure I understood it all, but I did read it. But it's really great. And as David knows, I'm one of those fundraising geeks who really loves data and loves to get into data and loves to see how analytics and data and understanding can impact fundraising. But I also have a degree in psychology. So to some degree, this stuff for me is we're sort of bringing together my formal education and my passion for Excel spreadsheets into one thing. So I want to thank you both for putting in the time to do this kind of research. This is the kind of thing that is really helping to shape our field and moving us from a bunch of people who have a gut feeling about things to people who really know what we're doing and have some real scientifically thought out and researched and proven data to work with. And it's really taking the profession to a higher level of professionalism. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and thank you both for your time today. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I'm sure the audience has loved this information as well.